Um, if you remember the last time we talked about CSR, so there was this idea of Bowen in 1953, this idea that, okay, you have a lot of impact, therefore you have responsibilities, you need to work for social betterment, but kind of left it there on what to do exactly. And the answer of Milton Friedman was to say, well, be careful, because if you do work for social betterment, you're making yourself a political actor, even though or a civil servant, even though no one elected you and no one appointed you. So Friedman was, in his libertarian view, very much opposed to this idea of CSR, partly because he saw in it a kind of communist, socialist plot, but also because he was worried about this political power that it granted. And we've seen with the work of the historian William Frederick that there was a shift from CSR1 to CSR2 in the 70s, from the idea of responsibility, which is more moral, to responsiveness, which is more political, which is more strategic. And the worry of Frederick was, as he said back then, it was to say that it takes the moral hit off the corporation. And all of that puts corporations, in terms of social responsibility, into getting more involved in society, involved in politics. And that's why some academics published an essay in the California Management Review, saying that CSR needs, so corporate social responsibility, needs CPR, which is a play on word, but here CPR is corporate political responsibility. Basically, their thesis is to say that the idea of sustainability has become widespread. Right? It's gone mainstream, as they say, with most companies today, most corporations are in some variation showing some kind of sustainability policies, whether they call it sustainable development, whether they call it SDGs, whether they call it CSR. There is this idea of sustainability that has gone mainstream somehow. But how it is organized, who is responsible, and who is setting the bar for this responsibility remains unclear. So we've seen that with Frederick already. Um, Here, what they offer to think about is this very powerful idea of those, and I'm quoting here, those who assess firms on their social and environmental performance should add another critical dimension to their assessment of civic virtue and responsibility, namely the extent to which firms support or oppose public policies that contribute to sustainability. So what they're saying is that it's not enough to just say what you are doing in your company in terms of sustainability, but are you doing something else outside of your company, in the form of lobbying, in the form of domination, in the form of support, in the form of revolving doors, in terms of sustainability? The idea being that maybe there's something problematic that is being done aside from CSR policies. Um, the whole idea that we would put sustainability and sustainability framework out in the marketplace and companies would adopt them is this idea of market for virtues. As they say, a decade ago, in an influential book, David Vogel assessed the potential for business leadership driven by the market for virtue rather than legal requirements to fill the government's gap left by increasingly gridlocked states. The idea was that the state was not able to answer sustainability stakes of sustainability and its issues, and that there could be some kind of filling the governance gap by having a market for virtue where companies would step in. And as they say, thousands of companies around the world have signed on to the UN Global Compact, which bills itself as the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative, and have agreed to its principle for the improvement of human rights, the treatment of labor and the environment, and the reduction of corruption. So you had that idea that the UN defining a framework, and it's called the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and companies will use that framework to work for the social betterment. Um, what they show in this essay is the limits of that promise and the importance to take into consideration this corporate political responsibility. As they say, they define it as a firm's disclosure of its political activities and the advocacy of socially and environmentally beneficial public policies. So it means that yes, you have your CSR policies, you have your CSR campaigns, and you are very transparent about it. But you also have political contribution, you have lobbying, you have campaign, you have funding that have a political influence over the policies, the regulations in terms of environmental sustainability. And when they say you need to add CPR to CSR, it's this idea that what you disclose in terms of corporate social responsibility, more or less regulated by a certain legal framework, you need to disclose also what you're doing in terms of corporate political responsibility. What are your contributions? What is your lobbying? What are you trying to achieve in terms of political influence? And here it becomes sensitive as a topic because it's when you start to talk about it, they show how it might open a can of worms for certain companies that might not be doing what they preach in the CSR world. They might not, preaching it in the CPR world. As they say, Mitchell Friedman argued against the idea of social responsibility of business. However, uh, uh, back when Friedman made this statement, there was not as much of an influence of corporation in the political world. Now, business leaders, as they say, play a creating a role in the rules of the game. So they are not. It's not about just respecting the rules of the game. It's about the idea that you can have an influence on the regulation as a company, and therefore you can change the rules of the game in your favor. If you remember, Friedman in his text says that the only corporate social responsibility is to follow the rule of the respect the rule of the game and abide by what he called the ethical customs of society. But here it's kind of a trick because what if you were able to change the rules of the game in your favor? Then you have a political activity, what is called CPA, political activity, and not just a business activity. And therefore, you should not just have a CSR framework, it's the thesis of the authors, but you should have a CPR framework where you account for that, and you should have some kind of transparency within that. The fact that these authors are saying you need some kind of CPR framework is to call for more transparency. So they're not saying corporation should have an influence on the political life, the regulatory life, the judicial life of their country in a certain way. What they're saying is that since they do, since they do lobbying, since they do influence, since they do funding, since they cultivate political ties and revolving doors, they should be transparent about it. So they are not saying that companies should do it. They are saying if you do it, you need to account for what you're doing. You need to be transparent. So as they write, the idea of excluding business from politics is unrealistic. However, since you cannot exclude them, you need to avoid secrecy. As they say, secrecy breeds a host of problems. One of them is corporate hypocrisy. It is you preach something publicly, but politically in the dark, you're doing something else. Another is corruption, where wealthy people could have undue influence. So what they're doing is to say, since there is corporate political activity, it's there, it's undeniable, and since you cannot get rid of it, what is important is to call for transparency, not just in your sustainability goals, but also in how your political activity is influencing these sustainability goals. So their recommendation, there's several, but I'll just focus on the main two, which is first, fully disclose your corporate political activity. So the idea underlying their thesis is to have a more more transparency in order to be able to have more trust. The second one is once you've been transparent about your corporate political activity, account for the connection or the disconnect between your CSR sustainable statement and your CPA, your corporate political activity. So their idea is not to reform corporate political activity. What they are saying in this article is because CSR has left room for a lot of political activity, a lot of politics. Remember, we've said that with William Frederick, CSR1 to CSR2. We said it even with Milton Friedman, with this idea that if you practice CSR, you're making yourself some kind of civil servant or some kind of politician. Since it leaves room for a lot of corporate political activity, it also leaves room for carrying corporate political activities that would be contradictory or detrimental to what you say in your CSR framework, in your CSR reports. So what they're advocating for is to say you need to be transparent about your corporate political activity. That's the first proposal. The second one is you need to show how this corporate political activity feeds into, connects into, reinforces your CSR policies and your CSR claims. And if they don't, you need to explain why they don't. So they call for more transparency in the articulation between CSR, your corporate social responsibility, and CPR, your political responsibility and the influence that you already have. So they're calling for more transparency in that articulation, which is a way to address hypocrisy or contradictory practices.